Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Rare Book Room. My name is Nicholas. I help direct the events here at Strand. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded in 1927 over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, running 400 events a year, and still housing new and used books. Tonight, I'm excited to have with us William Rosenau, PhD, a senior research scientist and author. Bill has also worked as a political scientist at RAND, as a counterterrorism advisor at the State Department, and as a staffer on a U.S. Senate terrorism subcommittee. His articles have been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Atlantic. He has appeared on CNN, BBC World News, CBS Evening News, and elsewhere. His latest book, entitled Tonight We Bombed the U.S. Capitol, launched just this week. And joining Bill in conversation tonight is Jeffrey A. Kressler, an associate professor in the Lloyd Seeley Library at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. At John Jay, he has compiled Justice in New York and Oral History with interviews of over 40 leaders in the field. At the College of Staten Island, he compiled 10 volumes of oral history interviews covering political issues and individuals. He's the author of several books and articles, including Greater New York Sports Chronology, New York Year by Year, a chronology of the great metropolis, Historic Preservation in Queens, and many, many others that are not listed. It's a great treat to have them here tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bill and Jeff to the Strand.
Hello, terrorism fans. Terrorism is a current event issue. Terrorism is a historical issue. We are taking a detour into one of the dead ends of terrorist history in the United States. And I'm just wondering, is it accurate to refer to them as terrorists?
You promised you weren't going to ask me any extremely difficult questions at the very beginning, Jeffrey. So I would really, no, it's a legitimate question. And for those of you who have the misfortune of engaging in the field, the somewhat questionable field of terrorism studies, every article, every book by any academic on terrorism begins with the definitional question. And there's much throat clearing and agonizing at the very beginning, but I guess it makes sense. It's a contested term, obviously, but there are lots of contested terms out there. I mean, what is democracy? What is pornography? What is terrorism? I think, you know, I'd come down on the side. Yes, they certainly wouldn't call themselves terrorists, but what they did was terrorism. And what do we mean by that? Well, people who engage in purposeful violence to achieve a political or social end. And importantly, fortunately, it has a very long definition, which is usually a bad sign, but the actual incidents are not in themselves as important as the knock-on effects. The symbolic effects, the psychological impact, the ability to inspire fear and concern in the general population. And I think most terrorist groups, certainly in modern times, have operated under the premise that they can erode the public's trust and faith in the state and the ability of the state to protect itself. So I think if those are fair enough criteria, I would say the women and the couple of men in the May 19th Communist Organization were certainly meet the terrorist, are worthy of the terrorist label.
One thing that we forget, we live in a safe city, we live in a safe time, we live in an epoch where we can't conceive of random urban violence that isn't a mugging, that isn't a crazy person interacting with you. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, beginning 50 years ago, we were in one of the most violent, politically violent periods in the history of the United States, and certainly the history of New York City. In the early 1970s, there were literally hundreds of bombings in the city of New York. Hundreds. If there's one bombing in the city of New York, when was the last time there was a bombing in the city of New York? I mean, a terrorist slash criminal enterprise activity like that. Can you imagine a time when this was seen as a form of valid protest? And so what we're looking at is a group of individuals who have a sense of social justice, but they act on this sense of social justice through terrorism. And they weren't alone during the 60s, 70s, into the 80s.
You're certainly right, and you're certainly right to bring in New York. I'm glad you did, because some of the action of the book is set in New York. Many of the participants are native New Yorkers, but it really is almost unimaginable to think about the level of political violence in this city. And Jeffrey, you've written about this, but particularly in the 1970s, where you had not just groups like May 19th, but you had the Black Liberation Army, which robbed banks and assassinated police officers. And I can only imagine, it's almost impossible to imagine that nowadays as a real method of political resistance. You had the FALN, the Puerto Rican separatist group, which blew up a portion of Francis Tavern in 1975, killed 4 people, wounded 60. They killed policemen in bombings, and so it was a very different time. But what fascinated me is a lot of those. What fascinated me ultimately about this story is, aside from, I mean, most importantly, that this group was founded and led by women. Many of whom had come out of the Weather Underground and other groups, but their persistence. I mean, this campaign really only ended in 1985 when 2 of the sort of last remaining super important members were apprehended. And one of the things I talk about in the book is, I mean, it's really staggering. So their stockpiles of weapons suggested that their ambitions were perhaps larger than just symbolic bombings of the U.S. Capitol or U.S. Navy targets or the South African Embassy or the Association of Israeli Aircraft Industries. In one of the busts in New Jersey in Cherry Hill in 1984, the police made off with, there were literally hundreds of pounds of TNT, det cord, dozens of automatic weapons, thousands of rounds of ammunition. And it sort of fascinated me. So this is 1984, and those of you who are old enough to remember the Reagan administration. So this is during the Reagan administration, and these people are so committed. They're continuing. They're continuing the armed struggle. I mean, the signs couldn't have been favorable, but through a combination, I think, of kind of group dynamics, loyalty to their comrades, a sense that anyone who defected was betraying their comrades. They kept this campaign going, and I was kind of fascinated by that story. The absolute. Maybe I can understand someone in the early 1970s doing this, but someone all the way to 1985 and still engaging in the armed struggle in the United States, I thought was just fascinating. And for those of you who choose to read my book, I hope you agree.
one of the odd things is, where do these individuals come from? And they come from middle America. They come from middle class. I mean, one of them was a certified red diaper baby. Judith Clark was a certified, and Susan Rosenberg also had some red diaper. You all know what a red diaper baby is. That is children of parents who were committed communists or socialists and who are raised in a communist, socialist, family values kind of home, going to communist camps and going to demonstrations at the age of 5 and 6 and all that kind of thing. But the rest of them were far from the typical red diaper baby. They're middle American. They come from middle-class families. They're not from broken, abused people who are taking revenge on the system because of the hurts that they've experienced individually. They are, I don't know, successful Americans. And yet, these are the people who decide to wage war against the United States of America, their own nation, in a very unblinking fashion. So here's a hard question. How do you account for someone like that deciding that, yes, it's a good idea for me to accumulate all this dynamite and a couple of pump shotguns and 9mm pistols?
It's a great question. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'll just bring out one of the characters. Here she is on the lower left-hand side of the cover, Marilyn Buck. She grew up in Austin, Texas. She went to a private Episcopal school. Her father was a veterinarian turned Episcopal priest who lost his church after he was involved in civil rights protests in the early 1960s. She went off to Berkeley. She came back to the University of Texas. We've got Susan Rosenberg, who was who attended Barnard. We have Judy Clark. Laura Whitehorn, who was a graduate of Radcliffe. I mean, these were people who, and I think it confirms something that specialists in terrorism have often noted, is that people who become terrorists are not psychopaths. They tend to be middle class or above. They tend to be well educated. And I think one of the reasons is, I mean, terrorism is a pretty complex enterprise. Psychopaths are not going to perform well under complex, stressful situations. They're not going to be the kind of people you rely on to plant bombs or, rob banks or whatever. And a lot of, he died recently, the Princeton economist, Kruger. I can't remember his first name. Anyway, he did a brilliant study on Palestinian suicide bombers. It's a real classic, one of the few classics in the field of terrorism studies, where he found that the Palestinian suicide bombers were overwhelmingly middle class, overwhelmingly educated, and it's a real puzzle that I think perhaps only a psychologist or psychiatrist interacting with that person on an individual level would ever be able to divine, like why the turn to violence? Why someone from a privileged background would turn to violence? They weren't in it for the money. They weren't in it for the glory. I think ultimately they were in it because they were, as I said earlier, the group. These are all people who were friends. They knew each other before. There was intense group solidarity. The group dynamics were very important, but also they were believers. Lawrence Wright, in his wonderful book on the Church of Scientology, by the way, someone told me the other day that what's his name? The most famous Scientologist of all, the actor, has left the Church of Scientology. Is that true? I find that surprising. But anyway, he had a wonderful phrase in his book on Scientology. He called it the prison of belief, and I think that really he really got at something. And I shamelessly, of course, ripped that off. No, I quoted him in my book. But these people, in May 19th were true believers. They absolutely believed in the cause. This wasn't made up stuff. This wasn't a cover to sort of glorify criminal activity. This was something that they were willing to absolutely give their lives for. And that's what puts them in, I think, the ranks of many other kinds of terrorism that is motivated by perhaps different ideological or religious causes, but very powerful here.
We start with, I guess we could say, liberals engaged in support for liberal causes, civil rights, protesting the war in Vietnam, ghetto housing, and the treatment of minorities in the cities. All of these are the farm workers. All of these are traditional liberal issues from the 1960s. And the protests ranged from, boycotting grapes, all the way to planting bombs. And if you could just run down where where the May 19th Communist Organization planted their bombs, so that we get a sense of the audacity of these women.
Yeah, so they really went through two phases, and the first phase between sort of 1979 and 1981, it sounds like ancient history, but I think for the people who lived it, it's all too fresh. And that was a period where they were deeply involved with veterans of the Black Liberation Army, which was an outgrowth of the Black Panther Party. This was the cop assassination, bank robbery enterprise. But a number of them kept that on. And they teamed up with these BLA veterans to do things like, well, it was really a weird kind of version of sort of Cold War domestic politics, where women were still in this kind of, I don't want to say servile role, but their job was to help the guys.
The Weathermen and the Black Panthers were all unadulteratedly sexist, female exploiting groups. I mean, that was part of their operation.
And it's in my book, but Mark Rudd, who was a big weatherman, he basically, and who was one of the few, I think, who really did a lot of meaningful soul searching, and his memoirs are really quite good. And he talks about his abuse of women, how women were in awe of him, women in the underground, how he exploited women for sexual purposes. That definitely went on. And so in some ways you would think, well, by 1979, the women who would form May 19th would be sick of this sort of secondary role. There wasn't that kind of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse that went on in the Panthers or the Weather Underground, but their job was they were armorers. They bought weapons. They rented safe houses. They rented cars. They did a lot of the logistics for this group that became called the Family. And and I think the reason was simple. They really saw these guys as freedom fighters, and they could contribute where they could. In the second phase, and that kind of culminated in the notorious Brinks robbery on October 20th, 1981, that left 2 cops and a Brinks guard dead. The women of May 19th basically changed course after that. The heat was on, and I think there was this sort of reappraisal about this, I don't even want to call it excessive violence. I mean, just insane levels of violence. And so they embarked on a bombing campaign. So their targets included the National War College at Fort McNair in Washington. They bombed the Washington Navy Yard twice. They bombed the U.S. Capitol, hence the title. And these were, you might call them, they bombed the South African consulate, which used to be on Park Avenue. They bombed the headquarters of the major police union in the United States in 1985 in their last bombing. You can say, well, this is all sort of symbolic, and they weren't trying to kill anyone. And, that's sort of an open question in my mind, because in their first communique, they said, or not in their first communique, but the communique after the November 7th, 1983 bombing of the Capitol, they said, well, we chose not to kill individuals tonight. We chose not to kill senators. We decided to target and I'm paraphrasing, we decided to target the institution of imperialism, but basically leaving open the door to the possibility that, yes, they would use violence against individuals. And in fact, over time, and something I found fascinating, and I think bears some similarity with other terrorist groups, as their world started to shrink and the authorities started to close in, they actually, I think, became somewhat more dangerous. And I read a lot of internal papers. I mean, these were all intellectuals, of course, so they're typing away in the middle of the night, smoking cigarettes, staying up all night, typing, writing, having self-criticism sessions. They talk explicitly about the time had come for assassination. Prosecutors, Henry Kissinger, a number one devil figure for many people, not just on the extreme left, judges, policemen. So they were moving into a realm that became, I think, more than just symbolic. And the fact that the size of their arsenals, they had multiple arsenals in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. I mean, I don't know, do you really need thousands of rounds of ammunition if all you're interested in is like purely symbolic violence? I'm not sure.
How many of you know where to buy dynamite?
Or steal it.
Any idea? Where did these people where did the internet? Yeah, Amazon. Where did these people get the dynamite? They got the dynamite in two ways. One, they would steal it from like construction sites and the like, which were not heavily guarded. Or two, you walk into a hardware store and you buy a box of dynamite. You could do that in, the weathermen did this in Vermont. Because it's a rural place, I'm clearing a field. I need the dynamite to blow out the stumps. And so, yeah, one box enough? Yeah, sure. No, give me another one. And so, like, it's a different time. Like, that kind of thing, it's a different time. And the other aspect of this book that is absolutely fascinating also deals with it's a different time. And that is, they couldn't do this today. It's like the way they did what they did and stayed underground and created these incidents am I right in saying this is absolutely not possible today?
I think it would be extremely difficult today. Although I have to say, okay, well, and it's important to know these were exceptionally capable people. So I didn't interview any of the women or men who were involved. They decided not to answer my questions, which is probably just as well. They're not going to get anything out of it. I know it's an old reporter's trick. Don't you want to tell your side of the story and blah, blah, blah. So I tried this for about a year and a half and basically got nowhere. So, but I did spend a lot of time with retired FBI special agents. And the ones who investigated May 19th, they were, I don't want to say in awe, but they saw them as extremely professional, dedicated revolutionaries. It was a little bit of a tip of the hat from the FBI. As to whether they could do it today, well, maybe not so much with explosives, but as we've seen in places like Charleston and El Paso, to name just two places, or the Sikh temple in Wisconsin, that people with access to small arms, particularly if they use those small arms in enclosed areas, can create enormous casualties. Now, in all those cases, it was kind of a one and done, right? You didn't have this underground apparatus. You didn't have people, operating under aliases. I mean, the people in May 19th had each one had a dozen different aliases. They had, they were very skilled printers, and so they could do fake IDs. They moved frequently. They had, you know, above ground jobs. They were professional revolutionaries. I think the challenges would be much greater today.
There's a television show in England that is, they give someone like a 12-hour head start, and they're supposed to elude detection for 24 hours or 36 hours or something. And so they get a head start, and then the authorities and everyone else tries to track down these people. And no one's ever pulled it off. They always get caught because the surveillance state is so pervasive, even more so in England than it is here, and absolutely in China. I mean, it's a terrifying prospect. You all know that if you want to buy a cell phone in China today, you have to have your face scanned and entered into the People's Republic of China database and linked to your phone. I mean, that's they disappeared, and they would disappear again, and they would become someone else again. They were able to get Social Security numbers. They were able to get driver's licenses. They were able to get library cards. Yep. They were, which is actually how they start. They go in and get a library card, and that library card could then be used to get their next pieces of ID. And people would hire them based on who they said they were. And they would disappear, renting apartments here, there, paper trail of people who don't exist. That's what I mean. Is that a possibility today?
It would be very difficult. I mean, those of you who are any renters here in New York, you know, anybody rent an apartment, know what it entails renting an apartment. Very different in the 1980s. Although one thing I agree with you. I mean, we have a surveillance state. It would be much more difficult to exist as a group for any length of time underground in the same way. But I will point out that two of the members of the group are still at large. So one was involved in a violent protest at Kennedy Airport in 1982, where a Port Authority cop was blinded in the eye, and it was an anti-apartheid protest. Donna Borup, she's been on the lam since 1982, and Betty Ann Duke, who was a very important member who was based in Texas, she got out on bail in 1985 and has been on the loose ever since, and the FBI is still looking for her. So even in this day and age, and the FBI, it's sort of, I don't think they're actively investigating her, but the FBI is sort of obsessed with fugitives in a lot of ways, and, you know, I guess that's a good thing. But in however long ago 1985 was, she's still in the run. She's close to 80. And there was some speculation a number of years ago that Betty Ann Duke and Donna Borup, the other woman, were traveling together as a Thelma and Louise team, which to me would be pretty bad terrorist tradecraft to be moving around the country together, two women. But so despite the size of our surveillance state, at least two of the members are still at large.
Sometimes when I encounter people like this, I think, you know, I wonder what it would be like to have a beer with this person. Would you like to have a beer with any of the people that you wrote about? Not counting the FBI agents. I'm talking about any of the individuals in the May 19th Communist Organization, the Black Liberation Army, any of them.
Is it okay if I have a martini?
Martinis.
Okay, because I want to, you know, get myself really.
You could have a Cuba Libre with Joanne Chesimard in Havana.
That would be nice. Joanne Chesimard, a member of the Black Liberation Army. Just a little side note. rather condescendingly referred to by a former federal prosecutor or city prosecutor as the Queen Bee, or Mother Hen of the Black Liberation Army. The women in this group in May 19th helped spring her from prison in 1979. She's down in Havana, as is Willie Morales, a member of the FALN, whom they also helped spring from the Bellevue prison ward. He's also in Cuba. He was a remarkable character in that he was suspected, and I think probably did make the bomb that went off at Francis Tavern, very skilled. He had a crib out in Elmhurst in Queens, and one day he was doing what he liked most, which is making bombs. I think it was a pipe bomb. And the thing went off in his face. It blew off half his face and 9 figures. Somebody called the police, understandably, this horrible racket going off. The police came in and they noticed that the stove, the gas stove, the knobs, had blood on them. And they figured out that Willie Morales had crawled, even despite these injuries, had crawled over to the stove on his stomach and used his mouth to turn on the gas in the hopes that the place would fill with gas and some cop would light a cigarette and the whole thing would go up. Anyway, real revolutionary dedication, absolute professional, and he is also in Cuba. He used to give interviews, as did Joanne Chesimard, but they've been lying low for a couple of years. Joanna Chesimard, also known as Sada Shakur, stepmother of Tupac. Interesting little side note. I don't know what that means ultimately, but kind of fascinating in its own right. She's got a couple $1 million of different rewards out for her, and she hasn't been seen in years. The women in the group, absolutely. I would love to talk to them. As I said, I reached out. I tried through direct and indirect means to reach them. I was totally unsuccessful, spectacularly so. People who were part of the wider May 19th group, which at one point had hundreds of members. I mean, they weren't terrorists. They were people who were in front groups and support groups, and it seems very unlikely that many of them would know about the clandestine activities of this kind of inner circle. But I reached out to many of them, and they basically, most didn't reply. Some said basically fuck off, which is fair enough. One of the guys in the group, Tim Blunk, who is he's a florist in Flemington, New Jersey. Anyone here from Flemington, New Jersey? Fleming, New Jersey? Anyway, he's down there, and he responded to me directly, and he said, I got an email from him, and he said, Dear Dr. Rosenau, having read your biography, what in the world makes you think I'd ever speak with you? Sincerely, Tim Blunk. And I totally respected that. That was the right answer. I mean, he was really good. So I would love to talk to them. They know about the book. I don't think they want to talk with me. I mean, I'd go to a tea house in Brooklyn and sit down or a bar. I mean, I would love it. I would love to get to know them. But they've pretty much circled the wagons. I think they want to put that phase of their lives behind them.
The other aspect of this story is that they did get caught, and that it was a years-long campaign. And we are terrified of the prospect of police surveillance, of police intrusion. In New York, we have something called the handshoe rules, which prevent the police from investigating political organizations without just cause. So we're very cautious of civil liberties and the abuse of police power. And in telling this story, I didn't get the sense that the police were engaging in extra legal activity to bring them to justice. I felt that they were playing it by the book and that they were dotting their I's and crossing their T's in this entire process. And no doubt there was a bit of respect for their adversary because they were so good at eluding them. But what about the overall assessment of the way law enforcement, the FBI, local law enforcement, addressed these women?
Well, thank you for asking that, because a big part of the book is that counterterrorism piece of it, and I was really interested in the origins of counterterrorism and how people started to conceptualize this as a singular phenomenon in a way they hadn't before, really in the 1970s. And so I looked pretty carefully at the law enforcement response, sort of at the galactic level, and then in the individual cases here. But one of the things, you're right. I mean, I don't want to say that the police and the FBI were gun shy. That's not really quite right. But after J. Edgar Hoover, who had served as director of the FBI for nearly 50 years, and whose men were responsible for, all kinds of illegal activity, which they openly acknowledged in some of their own memos. The FBI got out of the business and and I think ordinary FBI special agents were just as happy to be removed from anything that involved like political investigations. They didn't really want to do that anyway. I mean, Hoover and his top lieutenants did, but your average, special agent in charge in New York just wasn't interested in investigating people's political beliefs. And then in the 1970s, after Hoover was dead, and in the wake of Watergate, you had the Levy guidelines, which put, for the first time, a set of rules in place for the FBI in terms of what they could investigate and not investigate. Cities like New York, which had something called the Bureau of Special Services, or BOSS, which was what people at the time called a Red Squad. But there were similar organizations in every big city in the United States. And by the mid 70s, all of those had been shut down. They had literally junked their files. They were starting from a blank slate, which is, and so they it's interesting. One of the things that actually got them interested again was the Brinks robbery, because that told the FBI, there is this violent revolutionary underground that we've basically paid no attention to for years and years and years. But I think, in reviewing the case files, in looking at the thousands of pages of court records, all the accounts, all the primary sources, I mean, the FBI and the NYPD, which was important in terms of investigating this group, I think they were pretty scrupulous, and nobody got any kind of traction saying that there was, illegal spying going on, directed against them or anything like that.
We have time for a couple of questions. Is there anyone who has a question you are dying to ask? Yes. Question number one. There's a microphone coming.
There you are.
I think you mentioned earlier how defining the profile of a terrorist is very difficult, and that they're well-educated, middle-class society, and we have a lot of officials nowadays that spend hours on end trying to define the profile of what they deem to be a terrorist. Do you think that's something that's possible? Or do you think it's a retrospective view and said, well, maybe we should have seen this, we should have seen that, versus something that can be proactively achieved?
I think it's the latter. I think it's a retrospective thing. It's sort of the coin of the realm among terrorism experts, or at least it was for a long time. This idea of is there a terrorist personality? And if so, well, we should be able to identify. There's a book called Who Becomes a Terrorist and Why. But I guess part of the problem, and I'm no social scientist, but you're dealing with a world of with a very small n. you're talking about tiny, tiny numbers of people, and trying to generalize across a population and trying to identify who could actually turn to violent extremism seems almost impossible. I mean, it's. I'm not saying it's like pre-crime or whatever, but from Minority Report, but there's a little bit of that, and I don't think anyone has gotten anywhere trying to say, well, so this person, what's the likelihood of person A or person B becoming a violent extremist? I mean, you could narrow the group down from millions of people, but you start saying things like, well, terrorists are usually young, okay? Terrorists are well-educated or reasonably well-educated, okay? You could come up with, I've seen lists of 20 different factors that purport to offer some insight into who's likely to become a terrorist, and it's like 20 different factors. They're all so generic. You're still left with a huge number of people. It's not useful in and of itself. So I think it's really only through police work, ultimately, that and you know, all the post 9/11 stuff. If you see something, say something. You know, that's probably good, but it's usually like the neighbors or the family. You know, particularly, it's been the case with like the Lackawanna jihadist case. It was, you know, family members who had turned these guys in. So, yeah. So the answer, I think, is yeah. It's all looking back, ex post facto stuff.
Another question?
Yes, sir. Here you go. Thanks.
Is there any evidence that any key members of the group were motivated by religion or by a religious position or an anti-religious position over time?
That's interesting. I mean, I think, you know, some people have described, and all of the women and the men in the group were, you know, avowed Marxist-Leninists. That there was it was really a kind of secular religion, if that's not, you know, a contradiction in terms. I think they believed with the same kind of faith that intensely religious people, some intensely religious people hold. They had no particular religious beliefs that I was ever able to uncover, but they had a totalizing worldview through their ideology. That was the substitute. That was their alpha and omega, and could explain everything, could explain the course of human history and the trajectory of human history. So not faith of a religious kind, but faith of a very intense secular kind that in outward appearances is not really all that different.
It's not different at all. You've got if you think of I mean, in New York, we look at fundamentalist Christians who believe every word of the Bible and live their life based on what is in Genesis, Exodus, and what we have in the May 19th Communist Organization is a devout Marxist, Leninist, Maoist organization. They believe that for their authority, they didn't go to the book of Genesis or to the, book of John or even the book of Revelation. They went to Mao Zedong's tract. They went to all of the traditional writings of Marx and Lenin, and that was their authority. Well, what did Mao say in this situation? And so really there is a religious fanaticism to their thinking, and I don't know whether that helps or doesn't help in defining who they were, but I think it's a mindset, it's a kind of psychology.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and although it's interesting.
And absolutely crazy. Well, I mean, what they believed was absolutely nuts.
Well, and I hope it comes across in the book, I mean, these are people who are living in a hothouse environment. They're living in collectives. They only socialize with each other. Yeah, they have day jobs, crappy day jobs in printing plants and, just basically shitty jobs. But they're working full time, and in their rest of their hours, they're having self-criticism sessions. Why are you a piece of shit? Why did you fail to wash that dish? Are you committed to the revolution? These insane, they were extremely harsh and would sometimes go on for many, many hours. All of their information from the outside world is kind of filtered through. They have no independent access to information. But the thing I was going to say is, so one of the contemporaneous groups of May 19th was the Red Army faction in West Germany, which was far more lethal and ultimately far more dangerous, but literally about the same size, responsible for killing GIs and assassinations and lots of other bad stuff. But according to some FBI files that I had declassified, members of the Red Army faction, the RAF, visited the United States and visited with the women of May 19th and apparently came away very unimpressed with their command of the sacred text, that they were not sufficiently drilled on the intricacies of Marxism, Leninism, Maoist thought.
No one is pure enough.
No one's pure enough. You're talking about some hardcore German revolutionaries. They know their Marx and Lenin, and these gals and guys were not up to speed.
I ask that because we see some evidence of this kind of phenomenon of young women and men coming from different parts of Europe with no evidence of any particular religious, position or fanaticism or involvement in fanaticism, them going to Syria, becoming trained in terrorist camps, essentially, and then coming back and conducting acts of terror or their aim is to, from what we know, is to conduct these acts of terrorism for political / social / religious reasons. So I was wondering, if there's any analog between the phenomenon, because we see some of that, some evidence of that happening, now and in recent times.
Yeah, but perhaps like May 19th, I think it's also the case that many, would-be jihadists, particularly younger ones, maybe second generation or third generation immigrants into, let's say, Britain from Kashmir or elsewhere, have very little command of or very little knowledge of Islamic thought and scholarship, and are kind of picking it up on the fly almost, and are perhaps are motivated more by, I have to call it, risk-taking, thrill-seeking, maybe some of the same motivations that impel young men and women to, let's say, join the Marine Corps, right? You're in a boring-ass place. Your prospects might not be that good. Here's a chance to see the world, to have adventures, to serve on a team, right? I think that's a very, very powerful motivator for a lot of young people. And there, the theological part is almost window dressing, right? That's kind of the excuse. But I think with May 19th, despite their apparent lack of command of the of Marxism, Leninism, really were believers, because I tell you, looking at these court records and picking up a 20-page screed, like single space, like typewritten screed on the finer points of the dialectic, it's like, you got to believe this stuff. You're grinding this stuff out in your safe house, on and on and on, 20 pages, 30 pages. That's more than window dressing.
Someone else. 1 second.
Thank you. Were there certain advantages that came with there being women in terms of evading law enforcement? I imagine maybe they were underestimated in some respects, as opposed to, more of a male-oriented terrorism group. It's more of a yes or no question, really.
I would say definitely yes. Marilyn Buck, who we talked about earlier, the only white member, purportedly, of the Black Liberation Army, was able to do things that her black African American comrades weren't able to do. She was a nice Episcopal gal from Texas, tall, had a nice twang in her voice, was able to, I think, move about much more freely than, let's say, African American militants. And I think it was true also in the later incarnations of May 19th. I mean, in the book, I have some surveillance pictures, some FBI surveillance pictures, and they're dressed like, anyone remember the film Mrs. Doubtfire, Robin Williams character? I mean, they're wearing like extremely frumpy clothes. They were very good at disguises. They had this like big red glasses, and they were able to really blend in and move around in a way I think a bunch of guys living in the same situation might not have been. So I would say that particular piece, in terms of their tradecraft, they were less suspicious. In fact, after the bombing of the Capitol, the FBI and the Capitol Police, of course, did this exhaustive investigation and hundreds of interviews. And these people talked about, there was this like bearded Turkish Iranian-looking guy that we saw up in the Capitol. I was like, what? It's all completely, they got almost nowhere. Like the idea that it could have been women kind of didn't really occur to anybody.
Did it matter that they were lesbians?
Well, Laura Whitehorn, an important member of the group, she said in an interview, my lesbianism made me a better anti-imperialist.
Well, there you have it.
So, no, in the sense that she, from an early age, identified with, there's a documentary about her. I can't remember what the title is off the top of my head, but she says, look, when I was a little kid, I realized that I was different, and I identified with other oppressed people. I identified with the other. I mean, I can remember, my parents were driving through Harlem, and I was thinking, like, well, why are people being treated this way? So I think to that extent, and I'll take her at her word. I mean, how could we not? That she saw herself as part of a broader body of people who were oppressed. Now, I think the difference between May 19th and, let's say, feminists during the 1970s and into the 1980s, including radical feminists, talk a little bit about it in my book. There were a whole series of collectives and groups, Red Stockings in New York, very important. The women in May 19th, they said, well, women's liberation is all well and good, gay liberation, that's very important, but nothing is going to happen without revolution. That all this sort of all this other stuff is kind of second order, right? It's, when the revolution comes, we're going to take care of all kinds of oppression, be it sexual, religious, racial, or whatever. But until then, we're not going to get involved in debates about, daycare and abortion and stuff like that.
And of course, there is not one Marxist-Leninist revolution that has resulted in individual liberation.
No, and the other thing, I would put, to this extent, they were like jihadists and other really violent extremists. I mean, they're dreamers, they're utopians. They believe in a future, free of all the bad things that are going on in the world, be it imperialism, racism, sexism, the Crusader state, whatever. But it's all about getting there. They're never, no terrorists are ever really explicit about what that future is going to be like. Right? It's really it's really sort of, it's all about doing. It's all about the struggle toward that future. It's all about speeding up history. It's not so much like, well, who's going to handle wastewater treatment in this paradise of the future? Although ISIS actually did manage populations under its control, but it's really about the dream. That's the important thing. That's the motivator. Getting into the real specifics about, you could have a bicameral legislature and, blah, 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 not so important and really not thought out at all. It's keeping that dream alive. That's the motivator.
One of the interesting lines that I found in your book was a quote that suggested the revolutionary already inhabits its own future. The future that the revolutionary imagines, they are already there. And they're trying to make the rest of the world conform to the world that they are already living in. If we could be vaguely philosophical on that.
No, I think it's true, and they believe that they can speed up. They see history in sort of teleological terms. It's got a beginning and a middle and an end, and they believe that they can speed up that process. They can accelerate history through their actions, which can be extremely. It can be extremely dangerous. Obviously, I mean that's because it's saying, well, we recognize we're already there, and we got to bring you along at the barrel of a gun. That's kind of what the message is, and that's, needless to say, not a good situation to be in.
I personally would be terrified of the prospect of any of these women having the levers of power, actual power, at their command. I shiver at the world they would have created had they succeeded. And I know that's absolutely not going to happen in any way, shape, or form.
I mean, I came away somewhat. I mean, I wouldn't want to live under ISIS or some hideous Marxist-Leninist revolutionary state, or certainly not in some white ethno state that white supremacists would are trying to force us to at the barrel of a gun. But I came away with a certain amount of not sympathy, but I think empathy. Right? I think it would have been impossible to write this book without empathy. I don't subscribe to their beliefs. I think their actions were wrong, but they were done. They were done. I don't want to say for pure reasons, but there is a kind of a purity to them, and an idealism that's warped, but something that I came away respecting, people who are willing to give everything, to give up their lives for their beliefs, which again, I think can be dangerous, but it also, at least in me, engendered a measure of empathy, if I'm using the word properly.
One more question?
Sure, a short one would do.
Anyone?
Transitioning into the signing is also an option. Why don't we do that? Ladies and gentlemen, can we give a round of applause for Jeff and Bill tonight? Thank you very much. Thanks for having this discussion here with us tonight.
Thanks for coming out, and what a thrill to be at the Strand. I've spent many happy hours here. Thank you.
Of course.